Hello, hello, and welcome back to the Age of You podcast, a sweet secret to longevity. My name is Rina, and I am your host. We are quite used to hearing news stories and reading articles about novel cancer therapies, which are showing great promise. And frankly, this makes it very easy to believe that the cure for cancer must be just around the corner. Sadly, this is far from the reality, with most of the newly approved drugs prolonging life expectancy by a few months at best. My guest today has been insisting for over 3 decades that the best chance we have of beating cancer is by catching it early. I first had the pleasure of getting to know her through her book, The First Cell. Having dedicated her entire career to researching and treating cancer, as well as losing her husband from the very same disease, she was able to explore this disease from every possible angle. She has spent the last 35 years collecting samples from patients with myelodysplastic syndromes, or MDS, at risk of developing leukemia, in an effort to catch the first cell. As a result, she has created one of the oldest and largest tissue repositories collected by a single physician. She is a professor of medicine and the director of the MDS Institute at Colombia University in New York. A warm welcome to Professor Azra Raza. Hello, and thank you very much for making time to join our podcast today. You have dedicated your career to studying myelodysplastic syndromes, or MDS, from both an academic perspective as a scientist and a clinical perspective as a practicing oncologist. In your book, You Are the First Cell, which I have right here, you are very critical of the current state of cancer research, as well as the way these findings are being translated into clinical application. So I'm interested in what was it that convinced you that MDS was worth investing decades of resources, energy, funding into? What was it about MDS that was special?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on this incredible podcast and all the work you're doing. Congratulations. Um, I'd like to begin by answering your question and say if I had 72 more lives, I would do 72 times the same thing with MDS. I hope that convinces you of my passion. And the reason is actually very simple. As a teenager, I got fascinated by the idea of cancer intellectually because I realized two things. One is that within our body, we give birth to a cell that can live forever. No other life form on this world has accomplished that feat. And I thought if we can unlock the secret of cancer, we can unlock the secret of aging. We could become immortal ourselves. And second, the body is supposed to be like a nation, a state, and the cells are its citizens, and they're supposed to follow rules like liver cells have to stay within the liver, ovarian cells in the ovary, pancreatic cells in the pancreas. Only in cancer they walk out. In no other disease can cells walk out of their organs. And this intellectual fascination led me to medical school because that was the only way into science. And then med school, I saw patients, and that combined my passion with intellect. And my idea, from the moment I saw my first cancer patient, I knew that the rest of my life has to be dedicated to reducing their suffering. That's how I began. I come to America, I start studying acute myeloid leukemia and treating patients with it, and very quickly it was apparent that in my lifetime this disease won't be cured. So I realized I should study. Only thing that works in cancer treatment is early detection. So how early can you go? I said, well, I want to go to the first cell. I want to not study acute leukemia, but people who are at risk of leukemia. Who are they? MDS. MDS stands for myelodysplastic syndromes. It is a pre-leukemic condition. A third of the patients march towards leukemia. That was my idea. And I think it was a good idea 35 years ago. I think it's a good idea today. We should be studying people at risk of cancer to identify what are those uh, phase transition factors that account for a cell going from pre-leukemia to becoming leukemia, pre-cancerous to cancerous. And that's how then we can go to healthy individuals and try to prevent cancer. That's the whole idea of MDS. And yes, it's been worth every penny and every gray cell in my brain to work on this.
You mentioned that from the first cancer patient you worked with, you were convinced that cancer was the right point forward to you. I'm curious what type of cancer that first patient had.
Amazing that you ask. Actually, it was a bone marrow cancer. It was turned out to be a case of myelofibrosis, a 30 something, 32 or 35-year-old woman who had traveled from one of the uh, northwest frontier provinces, in the north of Pakistan, all the way to Karachi, which was the largest city, it still is, and seeking treatment. And she had a huge spleen. The spleen filled the whole abdomen. And the main point my teachers made was that you could not take this spleen out because spleen is doing the work of the bone marrow in this woman. This is where the cells are being. And if we remove the spleen, the liver will enlarge, and you can't remove the liver because then the liver has to take over the function. And this whole thing fascinated me very much also, that from the bone marrow suddenly you're transitioning to a, a kind of embryonic bone marrow formation, because in utero blood is made by the spleen and liver. So we're reverting back to those because the bone marrow is failing, so the body ignite some of or reinitiate some of those earlier programs. So that was it.
Before we go into more detail, I think one very open but crucial question here is, what is cancer? And I have to say that reading your book really helped me appreciate the sheer complexity of this disease and, by extension, the problem it poses. So, how has our understanding of cancer and its causes changed over the last few years?
Sadly, not very much. And although it's an extremely complicated disease, as you said, and thank you for reading the book, because 99% people who interview me immediately say, well, we haven't read your book, but we want to ask you. So here's an exception. You've read the book. Thank you. It is an extremely complicated disease, but on the other hand, remember that there is something called convergent evolution, which means things tend to converge also as they evolve. So let's say a liver cancer is very different than a leukemia, a bone marrow disease, or let's say a pancreatic cancer is quite different than cancer of the ovaries. But what's common in all of this is two things really. One, that the cell that becomes cancerous no longer responds to growth inhibitory signals. That is common to every cancer. And a second property that's common to every cancer is that it can literally, as I said, walk out of its organ of origin. It can invade other organs. It becomes very metastatic, invasive. Those are properties of all the cancer cells. So there has to be something common, right? And that's a convergent evolution that leads to some common. And so the prime cause may be common as well, is my point.
Coming back to your book, which was incredible to read, um, the urgency for a new approach to cancer diagnosis and treatment is so beautifully portrayed in your book through relationships you develop with your patients and obvious agony and frustration you go through every single time that the available treatment methods do not suffice. So I think that your empathy and your dedication to a field which, in your own words, is in a crisis, is truly admirable. So I was wondering, would you say that having been on the other side of the hospital bed as a wife of a patient has changed the way you work with your own patients?
That's a deep question you asked.
I apologize if.
No, it's a thank you. It's a very important question. No need to apologize. I have thought about this myself a lot, and I don't think I changed really as a doctor as much as all my perceptions changed as a result of the experience of seeing someone you feel like your life depends on. You love them so much, and yet you, over a period of 5 years, you see them slowly die. And that experience leaves you, uh, the word changed or evolved or metamorphosed, none of them suffice to say, to describe to you um, the kind of soul shattering insights that suddenly become a natural part of you. So everything you look at now is still, the things are the same, but your eyes have changed so much by the insights you've developed that your sight is now very different. And that's an experience that I must say left me in a way numbed for a while. After taking care of someone where every sulcus and gyrus in your brain is constantly focused on a cancer and a person who's dying of cancer. Every action I made, should my daughter who's 5 years old have a play date? Well, it was affected by what time was Harvey getting chemotherapy or what time did I. So everything is ruled by that for 5 long years. And then suddenly he dies and you have nothing. It's like emptiness. I couldn't even listen to music for 2 years. It meant nothing to me. It used to irritate me in a way, and I love music. So when you ask me, did it change me as an oncologist? I have to say that it's impossible not to change as a result, because as a person, I changed so much. So whether I had more empathy now, I don't know. At that level, I'm the same person, but because my perceptions are different, the empathy level must be different. I hope I'm making sense, but it's a difficult question to answer. The short answer is absolutely, it has changed me as a person, and it has changed me as in every way, um, in which I react to things.
I think through your book, it's just so obvious how empathetic you are as a person and as a doctor, and I don't doubt that even prior to this experience, you had ample empathy for your patients. But on this podcast, we predominantly focus on topics of longevity and chronic inflammation. In your book, you said something that I found very interesting, which was that aging is the most potent carcinogen. So you explained this by using the mist of aging, and I really like the acronym. So could you explain for our listeners?
Why don't you read that little thing? You're such a
Oh, right.
beautiful voice.
Thank you.
That would
uh,
be lovely.
for the listeners who have the book next to them, this is on the page 81. At least four major areas of profound biologic alterations turn the aged body into a hotbed where malignant cells can thrive. I call it the mist of aging. First are the mutations. In addition to heredity and exposure to toxic environments, each new round of DNA replication as a cell divides causes fresh copying errors. Cellular metabolism also causes DNA damage. Mutations from these sources add up over time. The second is the immune system's increasing inefficiency. All bodily processes, become more decrepit with age, causing the immune system to falter and miss eliminating a cancer cell at its very inception. Third is an increase in the number of senescent cells with age. Senescence by itself is anti-cancer because the cell stops dividing. However, it is carcinogenic for other cells because it is still metabolically active, producing waste material that accumulates, causing the natural habitat of cells to turn toxic. This inflammatory microenvironment provides the ideal soil for the abnormal cancer seed. Finally, there is the problem of tissue loss with age, dramatically visible on the face and neck, but equally disfiguring internally. Tissue depletion leads to geographic reorganization in organs such as the bone marrow, with resulting spatial renegotiation between cells whose activity depends upon precise physiologic gradation of chemical signaling. These four factors descend like a mist that cloaks the elderly in the possibility of cancer. Where in Pear's model, a grain of sand is eventually enough to tip the system into an avalanche, the bodies of the elderly are engulfed in a swarm of them.
You did a perfect job, and that's exactly it. I call it the mist.
I think it was perfectly described in your book as well, as we've just heard. So moving on, since we've mentioned the microenvironment, one of the points which you make very clear is the limitation of the reductionist approach, which is used by many cancer researchers. One of the examples of this, as we've just heard, is that the importance of the microenvironment of the cancer cells is often overlooked. So that brings into question how accurately can these cell lines actually represent the tissues or cancers they come from?
Brilliant question. Not only have you read the book, you have really grasped the import of what I'm trying to convey. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to talk to someone who
Thank you.
is knowledgeable and is interesting. So here's a very interesting answer. As we just discussed, with age by itself, there are areas of chronic inflammation that start developing in various organs because cells don't age and simply die. Many of them just hang on as senescent cells. They're not doing any useful function, they're not performing it, but they continue to sort of excrete or exude toxic material that poisons the environment. Another way that microenvironment can get very toxic is if let's say in the liver, there's an infection by hepatitis B virus. And so it causes chronic inflammation. Lots of cells are dying. In these states, when the microenvironment is poisonous, cells start getting a signal, fight or flight. Either you're going to develop a strategy to survive or you're going to die. And my new cancer model, which you will love hearing about, is that because of the stress of the microenvironment, cells get signals to develop strategies, and the strategy that biology uses is to throw out 1,000 different diverse responses, and then one of them might work, right? So in this stressed environment, one thing that can happen is that a blood cell has arrived, let's say an immune cell from the blood, like a macrophage, to eat these dying cells. But a dying cell from a liver that gets into the blood cell doesn't die. So it doesn't die, it fuses its DNA with the DNA of the blood cell.
Forming giant cells.
Sorry, yes, exactly. Forms a giant cell, a big cell. But now it has endowed itself with two of the basic properties of a cancer cell. Number one is, because it's inside a blood cell, it's mobile. Now it can walk out of the liver. And number two, why isn't that cell which has walked out of the liver being recognized as a foreign cell by the blood and immediately killed? Because it's inside of blood cell. So it evades the immune system. So my new model of cancer is that the first cell is really two cells.
And your new model can really not be investigating with the cell cultures we are using at the moment.
Absolutely not. Because the problem with those kinds of artificial things is that the result of pursuing those artificial things is that today the mortality from cancer is the same as it was in 1930. And that is something which we should be really ashamed of, embarrassed about. We are refusing to take the blinders off our eyes. We keep investing in these schemes that really are so complicated and so toxic in the end and benefit so few patients and financially are bringing the whole healthcare system on the verge of a collapse.
I just want to repeat what you've said. You are saying that our methods of treating cancer have not improved life expectancy since 1930s. That's 90 years. Just for our listeners to realize what we're saying, that's incredible amount of time, an incredible amount of money invested in research and therapy development.
Let me be very clear. 70%, 68% of cancers we diagnose today we can cure. But we are curing with what is the question? Slash, poison, burn. Why? We were doing that 100 years ago. Why are we doing the same thing today? And then, second, the 30% patients who present with advanced disease, their outcome is no different than it was in 1930. And 1930 only because that's when statistics started to be collected. You can go back 1,000 years, really, or at least 100 years easily, when we started to do operations and had radiation was already available. So those are my points. Why are we using these Stone Age Paleolithic technologies today? We were slashing breasts 2,500 years ago for breast cancer. What are we doing today for breast slashing? So what are we doing wrong? Why aren't we able to get better? I think it's because we have been targeting the wrong goal. We have been targeting the last cell. We try to kill the last cell. No, I'm saying we should be proactive, not reactive. We should go for prevention rather than cure. We should go for the first cell rather than the last cell. And as you wisely pointed out, citing that first cell is impossible in a petri dish. So how do you cite it? Well, by the time cancer declares itself, there's already hundreds of millions of cells. So the only way to cite it is try to do what I have been trying to do, which is go and study people at risk of cancer. So, by the way, during this pandemic, I put together a coalition of 8 institutions, the top institutions in America: Columbia, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, MD Anderson, University of Chicago, Northwestern, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and Montefiore. 8 of the top institutions in the country. I said to them, look, point out the fatal flaw in my argument that we have to go for early detection, which is much earlier than stage 1. And if you can't, then you have to join the revolution. Guess what? Everyone joined the revolution. 2 things resulted from it. One, we wrote an opinion paper, all of us agreeing that indeed going after the first cell is the future of cancer research and treatment. Prevention is the way to go. And we published this in Scientific American, January 8th, 2021. There are 30 authors with me. I'm the lead author, 30 authors behind me. Because everyone agreed from these major institutions. Then I said, okay, talk is cheap. Let's do it now. So I convinced my colleagues around the country to start collecting samples on cancer survivors. Now, I don't want anyone to get scared. If you are a cancer survivor, you're fine. Your risk for getting a second cancer, not recurrence of cancer, I'm talking about a second cancer, is very small. However, if you look at individuals who actually are diagnosed with cancer, then 20% of them are cancer survivors. And you read the story of my husband, Harvey. At 34, he got one cancer and survived that horrendous experience. And then at 57, he got his second completely unrelated cancer from which he died. So, if 1 in 5 new cancers appear in a cancer survivor, and cancer survivors regularly come for follow ups and checkups to their hospitals where they got treatment for the first cancer, my suggestion was, why don't we just draw some non invasive samples like 30 cc's of blood, saliva, urine, feces, hair, nails, and save them? If 8 institutions work like this, in the first year we'll have 16,000 samples. 500 of them will have developed a second cancer. Now imagine we have all these samples from before they got. So what am I looking for? Number one, from the blood, I'm looking for that first cell. But it brings me back to the most important thing. My opinion is that in the future, we will not be treating cancer by targeting even the first cell, but trying to reduce the stress that caused the appearance of the first cell. Whether that stress is coming from aging or an infection or an autoimmune disease or exposure to something toxic, we don't know, but we want to pick stress markers, metabolites, and proteins of chronic inflammation and stress that are responsible for the phase transition once again from going from a precancerous state to a cancerous. What is the change in the metabolites that are being shed in the blood, in saliva, in urine? Why hair and nails? Because my friend Ken Pienta at Johns Hopkins convinced me. He said, Azra, think of it like this. You can tell the constituents of an ocean by examining a cup of water. That you take, skim from the top a cup of water, and you can tell what's half a mile down deep into the ocean. So why not hair? Why can't hair and nails tell us what's going on? And he's right. I'm not going to say anything more because he hasn't published the papers yet, but it's dramatic what he's finding, especially in people getting chemotherapy. So the point I'm making is simply that 8 institutions have come together to start saving samples on cancer survivors. Within 2 years, we'll have enough samples. We'll have caught the first cell and the stress markers in thousands of patients who have developed a second cancer. So we have their samples from before and immediately after, right? And now we can compare for the phase transition, do all the studies I'm talking about. It required $22 million, but I raised it.
Congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you. I think it's going to be a game changer.
I absolutely believe in you.
And you know, science is something very interesting. I want to say one last thing here. Art is I. Van Gogh could stand and paint the starry nights by himself. But science is we. There is great strength and power in consensus building because each of us bring complementary strengths to the table, and all of us are standing on the shoulders of giants. So it is not as if we started and I, me, mine, I, me, mine. No, science has to be we. And I'm a firm believer in going to the top scientists, the top clinicians, the top oncologists, the top researchers, and getting them convinced. Okay, tell me what am I saying wrong, and I'll believe you and I'll do what you are doing. And so I think that this consensus, this kind of a group effort to really turn the entire cancer paradigm on its head, go from the last cell to the first cell, is the way it's going to change. I'm very excited about it.
So am I. And I think before we come back to giant cells and biomarkers, I think for our listeners to understand the problem with the current model. And I have to say, I feel very grateful for having a chance to talk to you because as a young student of science, um, I think I am much more at risk of idealizing the current medical and scientific paradigm. And, seeing as I'm spending so much of my time studying and striving to be a part of this world, it's quite unlikely, it's quite unnatural for me to critically assess the scientific system that we are currently having. So thank you for opening my eyes, especially to the fact that the hype I hear about cancer therapies very often is just that, a hype. Um, so now mouse models have, for decades now, been the norm. Um, and yet humans and mice differ quite extensively from each other, from our life expectancy to our metabolism, our immune systems. Why do you think mouse models continue to be the norm for developing therapies?
You know how I ended up actually writing the first cell is because there is a kind of interesting challenge that's given out by my friend John Brockman, who is always trying to bring together what he calls the third culture, which is the culture of science and the culture of the humanities together into a third culture. And annually, he gives to about 150 people he thinks are worth asking a question, and luckily I'm one of them. He'll send this question out, annual question. And one year, like back in 2014 or 15, he asked the question, what scientific idea, in your opinion, what scientific idea will make the biggest change if it's given up? So I answered, the mouse models and mice are the real elephants in the room. And I said, just look at the data. 95% of everything in cancer is failing to help patients because we are trying to look what we do. We take a mouse, we kill its immune system. Now, mouse doesn't get the kind of cancer, for example, I'm studying. So, how am I going to have a mouse model of MDS or acute myeloid leukemia? Well, I kill the immune system of the mouse. Then I transfer some cells from my patients to this mouse. 90% will die immediately. Some will try to survive, and one or two will take off and start growing. And now we treat this mouse with a drug we think should work, and it works, and the mouse is cured. Now we claim that this drug is curing acute myeloid leukemia and bring it back to the bedside. Well, 95% times it fails, and the 5% times it gets approved. I think it should have been considered a failure because it's extending survival by 2 or 3 months for 20 to 30% patients. That's it. And it costs millions of dollars, $100,000 a year. Now, if I don't prescribe this drug, I'll go to jail. Why? Because if my patient dies, the family can sue me and say this drug was approved, why didn't you give it? And I'd say, well, 70% chance wasn't going to do anything, and 30% chance that median of 2 months. Well, no, one person out of those 100 lived for 2 years. Maybe it could be my father, my son, my brother. And you withheld the drug. So those are the issues. Mouse models are so popular because they're very easy to use. You can do anything to mice. You can kill their immune system. You can't do that to humans. Secondly, 90% of researchers who are studying cancer, they are not oncologists. They are PhD doctors. So they don't have access to patients. So they have created this whole castle in the air, basically, a house of cards claiming that they are studying cancer. But yes, of course, they're studying cancer, but if not even a cancer that the mouse gets, they're studying something completely artificial that they have created and claim that it is. It's horrifying. I don't understand why people are not looking at this seriously. I don't know. I can't answer. You tell me why you think this is so.
I think it comes back to what we mentioned earlier. We are so accustomed to this reductionist approach where we look at one gene, we look at one protein, we look at one signaling pathway.
Well, here I think our institutions have failed us. Why? Because they could have provided human samples to these individuals. It isn't like people are not getting cancer. Millions of samples are available. They are sitting, rotting away in pathology departments, in freezers. Why? Because these very people themselves don't want to go even and bother. They are the ones who sit in study sections and give all the grants, and it's easier to study mice everywhere. Institutions should have been more strict and say, no, this is artificial, you can't do that, we'll provide you with the samples that you need. But they haven't done it. So I think it's not just the failure of scientists or academia or pharmaceutical industry. I think the very institutions that are supposed to protect patients are not protecting patients. So John Brockman liked my answer very much. And by the way, that year, my answer made the headlines in The Guardian, The Observer, and everywhere newspapers picked it up because it was the first time. And then I went on this Freakonomics NPR program. It's called Freakonomics Radio Hour. And I gave a long interview back in 2014, and they replayed the whole thing when the first cell came out in 2019, saying, you were right, you were prescient back then, so we're going to play it again. But so John Brockman, who gives the question, liked my answer so much, he's a very good friend. So he and his wife, Katinka, came one evening to dinner to my place, and they said, well, you have to write a book. Because he's also an agent, a book agent. And he said, no, your idea was the most important one. You keep telling us all these issues with cancer problems. So I insist that you write a book. And for 2 years, I didn't listen to him. I kept saying, I'm not a writer, I can't write, I'm not a writer, I'm a scientist, I'm an oncologist, I don't have time. He wouldn't listen to any of my excuses and made me do it.
One of the things I disagree with you with what you said, and that is that you are not a writer.
Oh,
I have really, I have not been able to stop thinking about it for days after I read it. So thank you for writing it.
well, there are multiple authors in the book. Like chapter 6 is basically written by my daughter and Andrew's sister. And then at the end of the book, I have done something which no one has done, which is go back to families who lost their loved ones to cancer and ask them 10 years later, thinking back, what decision would you have changed? And then they wrote. The last part of the book is by these family members. And that, I think, is the most deeply moving parts to me, what they had to say.
Exactly, because I think this book is so rich in a sense. You completely deconstructed the cancer paradigm from a scientific, from a clinical perspective, but then you also allowed these families to tell their stories. So I think I want to come back to something you have mentioned, which is the price of these medications. The financial burden on these families and these patients is undeniable. So how do you reflect on this as a clinician and as a wife of someone who was treated?
I think you're pointing out a very sensitive area here because we don't want to discuss costs of a drug when we are prescribing it for a patient, and that's a disservice to the patient, because they'll just, if I tell the family, well, this is the next drug I want to give, and they find out that it's costing, the co-pay is something like $7,000 a month, they'll mortgage their house to give it, because, but they don't realize what a small chance this drug has and what the outcome is expected, as well as we do. So these are very sensitive issues. But as a result of not being completely able to discuss with the families and the patient, the result is that today 42%, and that's a huge number, that's like half the patients, 42% of all cancer patients diagnosed today completely become bankrupt by the second year. They lose every penny of their last saving. In America, we loot them of every penny they have saved all their lives. Think of it, by the second year. And you can't make up these statistics. They're all there in my book. So the questions are so profound. Everyone is paying the price for this, but the most profound effect is on, in the final analysis, on the patient, and then once the patient dies, on generations of that patient to come, because the next generation's life is ruined also. 80% of healthcare costs are because of the last few months of life, and in that 80% we manage to fleece every last hair from them. So I think that it's an obscene and a horrifying system in which the only people who are really benefiting are always the people on top, the business people, and the ones who are losing are at the bottom. If you think about it, in a healthcare system, the two people who have skin in the game are doctors and patients. Well, doctors are overworked and underpaid, and patients are always having to meet the cost of ineffective therapies. So we are basically uh, taking advantage of both. The system is taking advantage of both. And the only way to change it is to completely overturn the system. How? Once the word processor was introduced, no one thinks of the typewriter. We need to show success of the new model, early detection, the first cell, the stress markers. If we can find those, are we able to prevent? If we can show that, no one will worry about these therapies tomorrow or these mouse models, right?
And you, as a perfect example of someone who has been advocating this for decades now. And our listeners will be happy to know that you have not spent these decades sitting around and waiting for someone else to listen to you. You have spent these 35 years collecting over 60,000 samples from your patients. And I want to stress this, you collect them yourself from every single patient. How are these samples now going to be used for your new model?
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, these samples are come from my patients. Every vial is meaningful, has a poignant story, brings back memories of the patients that I took it from. And you're right, I do the bone marrows myself. In clinic, I'm working like an intern to this day. And I draw all the bloods, I ask the patients, and no one has ever refused me. I can't remember anyone in 35 years who said no. And I started saving samples, and no one was thinking about it. In 1984, people thought I was mad, but I just kept saving them in my freezers. And continuously, I have used these samples to develop new biologic insights into the disease and collaborated with scientists from NIH to Stanford to Yale to MD Anderson um, to Harvard, given hundreds and thousands of samples, shared them with others because, as I said, science is weak. And if somebody else has a better technology, then of course we collaborate. And these are the very samples that have allowed me to learn so much about this disease, and be able to be so confident today to say all these things, challenging the very fundamentals of on which cancer enterprise has been erected. And yet I'm able to survive all of this and not be blown out of this universe as this chit of a brown immigrant Muslim woman coming from God knows where trying to challenge us. No, I survive it because of the confidence I have in knowing that what I'm saying is correct. And all that has come from studying human tissue constantly, properly with colleagues, and publishing in high profile journals. However, the technologies were not that great in the past. Today, I can do proteomics, genomics, metabolomics, transcriptomics, glycome studies, everything on few cells, few drops of plasma, serum. And so today, what I'm doing is something more exciting. I'm using the entire tissue repository to try and study, number one, it has already been studied for whole genome sequencing by Regeneron, and the data are in the cloud already. Now we are developing the next steps to do proteomics and transcriptomics on the whole tissue repository. But with a company, Grail, which is based in San Francisco, this company is dedicated to early detection of cancer by looking for pieces of shed DNA which are mutated from cancer cells into the plasma or serum. And they have a methylation platform by which they can determine what organ is this piece of DNA coming from. So not only can they detect cancer early, but they can also say it's coming from the pancreas or the ovaries or the lungs. So I'm working with this with Grail, and they are studying my whole tissue repository, all those samples from pre-leukemia and then comparing to leukemia. What changed? How exciting is that? What changed? How the phase transition was called? So I have big plans for studying now the entire tissue repository, and big plans to bring the latest technology to bear, and can't do it alone. So I was in Chicago 2 months ago, and we are signing a contract with this company called Accent Edge, which is an AI company. Because AI is the heart of this whole thing. Let's say I do metabolomics and proteomics. I've already done the genomics on the whole tissue repository. Only AI has the power to go and do this big data analysis. So I've already made that deal. So I think this tissue repository is going to yield some incredible biologic insights about how to target that phase transition, but also the new tissue repository we are collecting for cancer survivors. So we have now two collections, both in which pre-leukemia to leukemia and pre-cancer to cancer of any sort, and study everything. Do you like that model?
I could not imagine a better approach. I think for our listeners, could you explain what is the meaning of a biomarker and how early detection could change the approach to cancer treatment?
Thank you so much. Biomarker is a very important word. So what happens is that um, as cancer is forming, the cells start shedding pieces of proteins, pieces of DNA, pieces of RNA, pieces of metabolites, which are also proteins but resulting from various chemical reactions that have occurred in the cell. And we think that the metabolism of a cell, the chemical reactions in a cancer cell are quite different from a normal cell. So the metabolites and proteins this will shed are different. Where are they shed? They're shed everywhere. They can be detected in the urine, in the feces, in the blood, in the saliva, any compartment of the body where we can find these. So these together are called biomarkers. Biomarkers are simply biologic markers of the presence of a certain kind of cell. And we think the malignant cell has a different, for example, has more mutated DNA. So when DNA is chopped up and thrown out, some of it escapes into the blood. Can we pick that piece of DNA and find that mutation? And then when we have a mutation, say, aha, this is definitely indicating the presence of cancer. Well, where is the cancer? Because so early that no amount of imaging devices we have right now will be able to detect it. So then we look at its pattern of methylation, what genes are turned up, what genes are silenced. And by knowing that, we can tell which organ it's coming from. So, for example, the company Grail. I'm a big fan of that company simply because they are doing this methylation marker in the blood. Their results are that they can detect 29% of stage 1 cancers already and 99% of stage 4. Well, my criticism of this approach is that you don't have to be a weatherman to know it's raining outside. So I don't need somebody, some special test to tell me that this patient has stage 4 cancer. It's obvious. I want to detect stage 1. Well, in stage 1, you're missing 70% of the cancers, 71%. You're only detecting 29%. But there's a very important point they make. The point is that they are detecting by doing this test. Number one, with one few drops of blood, they are looking for 50 cancers. So it's different than doing one mammogram a year or doing one colonoscopy a year, right? You are now using one drop of DNA to look for 50 cancers, and you can detect 30% of those cancers. Yes, you're missing a lot right now, but of course, we can always improve on this technology. But so it's called MCED, multi-cancer early detection, MCED. I wrote a paper about this, and in Scientific American it's published. But MCED, multi-cancer early detection, not one cancer at a time, but many cancers in one patient at one time. That's the approach that's going to be the winning approach. Secondly, another important thing is that they are picking up cancers for which there are no screening tests. You see, you can do a mammogram to pick up breast cancer, but we don't have good markers for brain cancer, good screening measures. We don't have good screening measures for ovarian cancers, killing so many women. So they are detecting these cancers early for which we have no screening measures. Is it worth doing? Absolutely. Absolutely. And with improved technology, we'll be able to detect 70 or 80%. So that is of stage 1, and stage 1 is curable, as you know. If we can cure 70% easily, that's, another big thing. So I feel that biomarkers are the ones that are going to lead us to, instead of examining one cancer per patient screening, we can do multi-cancer early detection through biomarkers.
Bringing it back to giant cells and what you've mentioned about, um, different screening methods which are available today. I was listening to your lecture for the Human Glycome Project, and I really liked, I think there were two examples where you showed that you were able to detect giant cells years before screening methods would have detected them. So could you talk a little bit about that?
When cancer starts shedding its markers into the blood, well, blood cells which are normal are also shedding their markers in the blood. So a few cancer cells compared to 50 billion normal cells, the markers get so diluted that until the cancer has reached stage 2, 3, 4, you can't even detect them. That's the problem, right? How do we overcome this problem? Well, one way is, instead of saying that there are only 100 cells right now shedding markers, so we can't pick them, well, why not pick the 100 cells that are shedding the markers? Why wait for only the markers? And so I was always very interested in going after the first cell. Why not go for that? And as I was looking for that, I befriended a wonderful scientist and hematologist who's Italian but lives in France. Her name is Professor Patrizia Paterlin. Patrizia and I became friends instantly as we met. She developed a machine called ISET, Isolation by Size of Epithelial Tumors, ISET. This ISET machine can detect one cancer cell from 50 billion normal blood cells. And so I said, well, I'm trying to detect one leukemia cell in a pre leukemia patient to try and predict when the patient will develop. Because once they develop acute leukemia, it's a universally fatal illness. And I said, it's diagnosed too late. We diagnose it from the bone marrow, and that means it's already too widespread. So, can I detect one cell? So, we started working together 6 years ago. And when we started working together, instead of finding leukemia cell, I started to find these giant cells. Now, Patrizia has already published uh, some 10, 11 years ago studies of heavy smokers with lung disease who were at risk of lung cancer. And she found several cases where she had found similar cells in those individuals who did not develop actual cancer for 3, 4 years. And when they developed it, it was the cancer that was predicted by the presence of those cells being detected for 3 to 4 years. And so I think that this is a fantastic new area in which we are trying to catch the earliest cancer cells. And as I said, instead of cancer cells, very early markers seem to be these giant cells. We don't know what they mean right now. We don't know what these giant cells are, what is their origin. However, over the last 10 years, a lot of insights have been developed, and it seems that the most important contribution of science in this area is that that cell is not one cell, it's a fused hybrid cell. That's what it seems like as the major culprit. So, four groups are really seriously working on this. One is ourselves. We just published our paper. I'm happy to send it to you about these giant
Please
cells.
do.
Yes. Second group is the father of, I think, this giant cell, this polyploidal giant cancer cell, is Jin Song Lu at MD Anderson. Another scientist there, Steve Lin, who's a radiation oncologist, also interested in trying to trap these abnormal cells from the blood. He calls them, and his approaches, they call them camels, which is cancer associated macrophage like cells, because they're finding macrophage markers. I think macrophage markers are there because it's the fusion of a macrophage with the tissue cell. So, MD Anderson, these two scientists, ourselves at Columbia. At Johns Hopkins, I think the finest scientist, Ken Pienta. He's doing amazing work in this area. And the fourth is from the Oregon Health Science Center in Portland, Oregon, Professor Melissa Wong, doing amazing work in this area. So, guess what I did? I decided to hold a closed summit, bring us all together in one room and lock us up for 2 days and come up with some uniform ideas about what all this means. Instead of each of us calling these cells by different names, let's come up with some uniform nomenclature. Are they even the same, or are we finding 10 different types of cells? What is all this? So as I told you, I believe really science is we. So I'm bringing all these investigators together in one room, July 26, 27. My idea is let's get together, let's come to some conclusions, and then write and at least some, write up and publish whatever conclusions we come to, and then direct and focus our research in that area and collaborate. Do it together.
Excellent. Especially because is each of these people studying different types of cancer?
Yes, exactly. Absolutely right. Ken Pienta studying prostate cancer. Jin Song Lu is studying only GYN cancer. I'm studying leukemias, liquid cancers. And then Steve Lin and Melissa Wong are studying all kinds of solid tumors. But I'm the only one studying liquid tumors. However, with this cancer survival initiative, now Columbia University, all our cancer survivors are going on this study. So the leadership is behind me. Again, I do the same thing with the cancer center director, the dean, the head of medicine, the head of the division. Look, this is what I'm doing. I say, if you don't support me, then why should I expect support from the outside? And so they are wonderful people. I have to say, this is the beauty of being in America for me. That literally a chit of a brown female can get up and come here, and on the basis of merit alone, I can compete. And by law, no one can question that. That's the beauty of being in America. And I must say that I've been the biggest beneficiary of this meritocracy here.
I'm glad to hear that, because you absolutely deserve it. But for our listeners now, could you talk a little bit about the First Cell Center?
Yes, thank you. The First Cell Center is the center for, as I said, to identify and to target and eliminate the first cell at its initiation. The goal of the First Cell Center is the first, making cancer's first cell its last. And so, how do we do that? The only way really to do it would be, right now we are talking about taking blood from someone, passing it through a machine in my lab, finding the first cell, then trying to study the first cell, finding the right targets on it, then taking back treatment to try and only kill that first cell. And all this is happening simultaneously, by the way. But another way to do it is to work with biomedical engineers and develop a filter that's in the machine, but convert it into one that can be used like a chip on the skin or under the skin, which now can filter and catch any a cell larger than its pore. And then all you have to do is have an ultrasonic device. Just pass over it and say, there are 5 large cells today. Oh, tomorrow there are 5,000. So something is going on, that kind of thing. So the center, the First Cell Center I have created is really for the purpose of developing prevention rather than cure of cancer. And for that, biomedical engineers, imaging devices, people who are doing all of this stuff has to be combined. So the idea of the center is to bring multidisciplinary approach from across disciplines, bring the experts together. And at 3:30 today, for example, I'm meeting again with the biomedical engineering team. I have been mentoring PhD students with them for the last 4 or 5 years. So our collaboration has gone extremely well. And the PhD students are trying to develop this device. So I'm very happy to tell everyone that the First Cell Center, I hope, will be the center that develops a humane, a compassionate, a non-toxic preventive treatment of cancer.
What it sounds to me like is that this type of chip, once it's developed, is going to be implanted in many, many people who will be able to monitor themselves. Is that what, if I'm understanding it right? Because the capacity, I imagine, is not big enough to screen hundreds of thousands of people all the time.
Millions of people. So yeah, it's very true. In America right now, everything has been politicized. Masks have been politicized. Vaccines have been completely politicized. It is so pathetic. If I mention a chip right now, people, don't say chip, don't say inserted under skin, because everyone will blame you immediately start blaming you that you're inserting some kind of a signal by which you can track their money. I don't know. People have gone completely insane here.
It's not only in America, though.
Oh, it isn't? That's even sadder then. Because well, that's the problem, that America is the leader. People, when they ask me, well, is Europe doing better in cancer? I say, no, they can't be, because they're looking up to us for leadership. And if this is what Americans are doing, yes, they are creating the same kinds of distrust and mistrust of science and scientists, and it's horrifying. So I wanted to talk openly about the chip, but I'm afraid only because I don't want to be misunderstood. However, the idea is, yes, that from birth to death, we should simply have a chip installed that can detect not even the first cell very soon, but the stress markers. Anytime there's increased stress in some organ, it may lead to multiple sclerosis if it's in the neural system. It could lead to rheumatoid arthritis if it's in the joints. You know, every one of human diseases that we have failed to cure, basically, unless we can fix it surgically. We have failed to cure it unless we try to prevent. And so, for example, mortality from infectious disease came down dramatically once we introduced antibiotics. But the real change came when we introduced vaccines and prevented those diseases instead of treating them. And the same happened for heart disease. Yes, we can fix the coronary arteries, but anti-cholesterol drugs, better lifestyles are the ones that are changing really by preventing heart disease rather than treating. Same thing has to be done for every disease, and cancer is, of course, paramount, the first in all of this. And the idea is that, yes, these kinds of devices, these kinds of imaging technology and AI, combined with the use of multiple kinds of markers that can be detected um, from saliva or hair, nails, anything. Um, these are the future of healthcare. And anyone who keeps sticking to the old model, believe me, they'll be left behind.
Now, thinking of the future, I would like you to put yourself in my shoes. I'm in my second year of studying biomedicine. I'm very passionate about science. I want to pursue science. But now I'm witnessing a paradigm shift, not only in regarding to cancer. What advice would you give to young medics, young scientists who are just finding themselves in the scientific world?
Where are you, by the way?
I'm in London.
So you're at the heart of high culture in science. Um, what is it, Albemarle Street, on which the Royal Institute is? What is the address of the Royal Institute, do you know, in London?
I have to say, I don't know.
Okay, I think it's Albemarle Street, and that street is the first street in the world to become a one-way street. You know why? Because 100 years ago, the way that scientists would present their findings was like a story. They would stand in the auditorium of the Royal Society in London, and I have seen cartoons and pictures from those days which show that the people attending these kinds of scientific lectures, but they were told like a story, science as a story. Half the participants were women in the audience. Society women in London going to the Royal Institute to hear scientific discoveries like nitrous oxide. What does it mean? So um, that street used to be so crowded with horse carriages that they had to make it a one-way street. That was the first street to become. So you are in a place that really has given birth to the whole scientific revolution. And you are so fortunate. I don't know what you're doing, but whatever you are doing, pay full attention to that task for now. Your job is to learn as much as you can in every discipline and keep reading and keep educating yourself. I'm sure you have great mentors. Um, but once your education is done, that will be the important decision for you. How are you going to use this technology and how will you keep improving upon this technology? So, my and are you planning to become a physician as well, or is it a PhD route?
I think probably stick in science, but I would always want to make sure it has a clinical application.
Oh, good. That would be great if your application is going to be to directly affect um, our lives. I think that you are the one who's going to bring the real revolution now. I'm trusting and depending on you young people because of the way you are being raised, the training you're receiving, the technology that is at your fingertips. You know, it used to take 80 years to double the scientific knowledge not long ago. Then it took 20 years, then it took 7 years. Today, I think it's taking less than a few months. Scientific knowledge is doubling. So, and interestingly, it is at your fingertips because of the cyber revolution. That if a question comes into your mind, you just type it in Google, it's immediately answered from whatever technology, and then you can apply it to yours. You are one of the most fortunate people. My advice to you is keep doing what you're doing and pay full attention to it. Keep reading as much as you can and read a lot of fiction because that tells you the human stories. That really, I think, centers and grounds you into the human side of things. And you're going to be, you'll find your passion and you'll find your reason coming together very nicely.
Thank you. Now, as we are bringing this interview to a close, I would like to ask you for one final message for our listeners, be they doctors, maybe they're scientists, maybe they're individuals who themselves are dealing with cancer. What would be your one final message?
I think my final message is always the same, that never forget the human anguish angle. That we may think we know a lot and factually we may be correct, but it's important how you conduct yourself in life, not just what you know, but how you impart your knowledge. And I'll end by quoting Emily Dickinson in that. And that advice I hope all the young people in the audience will remember. The first line is so important, and then how she continues. Tell all the truth. You see what she's saying? She's admonishing you right away. Her command to you is you have to tell the truth. But now what comes next? Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. What is she saying by all this? You have to be sensitive to how you impart your knowledge. You have to tell the truth. There's no question about that. She's not questioning it. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight. The truth's superb surprise. Like lightning to the children, eased with explanations kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind.
Thank you. And thank you for joining me for today.
An honor. Thank you.
For all of our listeners, I think this conversation should have been enough to convince you to read Dr. Raza's book. But if it wasn't and you were interested in what we were talking today, I think this is an amazing place to start. I will also put a link to your website down in the description, which I found very interesting. There was a 5-year plan for the First Cell Center. And for anyone who is questioning what the next steps in cancer should be, I think that is a very good place to start. Our next episode will take a slightly different approach. as it will be in the form of a consultation. I have recently taken a glycan test and have gotten pretty interesting results. So I will be joined by Alexander Vojta, a professor of molecular cell biology and population genetics, who will help me put my results into perspective, especially considering my autoimmune conditions. If you are interested in finding out more about glycan, head on to glycan.com, where you can access a whole list of their scientific publications, blog posts, testimonials, and of course, this is where you can order your glycan test kit. Please don't forget to leave ratings and reviews for this episode and engage with us on social media. All of the links will be in the description. Thank you for listening and have a great day.